Wir haben wieder einen kleinen Gast hier, der den nächsten.
We have another guest here who's going to introduce the next speaker.
Mein Name ist Moritz.
My name is Moritz.
Ich wohne in der Patensenstraße 38C.
I live in Parkinson Street 38C.
Und ich möchte jetzt jemanden vorstellen.
And I'm going to introduce somebody now. Her name is Nancy.
Wie geht's denn? Das frage ich doch nicht.
How are you doing? No, I'm not going to ask that.
Die kommen natürlich auch nicht zu Fuß.
Well, she didn't just walk here. She didn't cycle here either. And I didn't think she drove here. I didn't think she took the train either. She didn't take a ship, did she? No, no, of course not. Of course she flew. No, she didn't take a rocket. No, 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 no. She came in an aircraft. Because where does she live? Well, she lives like far, far away in America. And then she came all the way from America.
Den Namen habe ich ja schon gesagt.
And
Die heißt
I
Nancy.
already mentioned her name. She's called Nancy. Daddy, I already told her name.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I am so happy, just thrilled to be here. My husband has been to this conference. This is your third time. And I had an experience at the U.S. conference this past summer where the German organizers, right after my presentation, started walking toward myself and Tim. And I sort of stepped out of the way because they all know Tim and he's the celebrity. And they came to me and ignored Tim. We heard the same story yesterday with someone else and asked me if I would come and present. And so I was just thrilled to be asked that they thought my presentation was good enough for this. So I'm just thrilled to be in this beautiful setting. I've never been to Germany before. And it's just so gorgeous, and the castle and the food is phenomenal. I'm really happy to be here. A little bit of background for me. I teach psychology at a community college, which is a 2-year, we call it a junior college. Whoops. Google. We call it a junior college, so students come for 2 years, and then they may get a vocational degree, or they may then transfer to a 4-year university. And so I work with very young college students, and it's a lot of fun. And I teach introductory psychology and lifespan development. But my real interest is in CHARGE syndrome and in severe disabilities. And so as a school psychologist who worked in the schools previously with children with disabilities, I became very interested in children with severe disabilities for one reason, and that is because my son has CHARGE syndrome. And I'm sure many of you have heard the story of Jacob before. Jacob is 27 years old. And after he finished school, we purchased the house next door to us in our neighborhood and moved him in there. And he has 24-hour support paid for by the government. And it's just worked beautifully. And one of the things I've noticed as a parent is that our children receive way too many diagnoses. And with those many diagnoses often come medications that I believe are unnecessary just from observing these children. We know that behavior is communication, and as we heard at the professional conference repeatedly, following the child, looking at the child, observing the child, instead of trying to figure out what they're doing wrong and medicating it, we need to listen to what they're saying and figure out what it is they need. So one of the diagnoses that is used very commonly is autism, but another one that we hear thrown around all the time is obsessive compulsive disorder. For 2 reasons, I feel I have the expertise to speak about this. One is because I teach it every semester I teach about the diagnosis, what it means, what it doesn't mean. And the other is that I have had the diagnosis myself. As a teenager, I had pretty severe obsessive compulsive disorder. My youngest son, Aaron, who has just been diagnosed with celiac disease a year ago, began that disease with a lot of anxiety, which is fairly typical. If you're not familiar with celiac disease, it's the inability to tolerate gluten in your diet. And it manifests first for a lot of people as anxiety, severe, severe anxiety. And so he went through many panic attacks, we went through medication, we went to psychiatrists, we went to counseling. But until he stopped eating gluten a year ago, this never went away. Now he has stopped eating gluten and his anxiety is gone. So it was just an amazing transformation to see. So not only have I had it myself, I've watched my son, very painfully watched my son go through it. And I know what it is from a professional standpoint. So when I see children with CHARGE syndrome diagnosed with this, it upsets me because I don't believe that what we're seeing is actually what we would call full-blown obsessive compulsive disorder. And so I wanted to try to make this very clear to people, and this is why I presented this in the US last year. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5 is what we use in the United States to diagnose psychological disorders. And so this is the definition I'm the most familiar with. It breaks down the disorder into two parts, obsessions and compulsions, which makes some sense given the title. Obsessions are thoughts. They are upsetting thoughts, upsetting fears. OCD is specifically related to anxiety. We all have a lot of anxiety and stress in our lives. If your anxiety goes over what you can handle, you may have a lot of fear. Fear of death, fear of, a very common one in OCD, fear of doing something wrong religiously and going to hell, fear of germs. You know, we all have different fears. And obsessions are thoughts about these fears, okay? Teenagers going through puberty may experience some of these things because their hormones are on high level. People who are extremely religious may experience some of these things, and I say in the US this happens a lot because we're a very puritanical, fundamentalist Christian society. We have a lot of fundamentalist Christians. And so if you're brought up to believe that if you do something wrong, you will go to hell, that can cause a lot of fear in a child or a young adolescent. So you have these persistent thoughts that you can't stop thinking about. If I do something bad, I'm going to go to hell. If I say a swear word, I'm going to go to hell. If I say something wrong against God, okay, I'm using this as an example because this is one of the ones I experienced. And I didn't grow up in a fundamentalist Christian home. I grew up in an Anglican home, which is very liberal and open, and we don't even really believe in hell. But for some reason, many people with OCD latch on to this idea anyway. So a lot of times when people have anxieties and fears, and you think about them, you may go into a panic attack, okay? Or you may get medication to help you with it, or you may go to counseling. But with obsessive compulsive disorder, it's different. In order to avoid the panic that may come with the obsessive thoughts, we tend to come up with ideas of what we can do to avoid them. And it's very magical thinking. For example, there's something we say in English, I don't know if it translates to German or other languages, but we say when you're walking down the sidewalk, step on a crack, break your mother's back. Have you heard that? And so it's just a child's game. But as we grow up, a lot of us, I've seen it in the US, even without OCD, avoid cracks in the sidewalk. It's just a very superstitious thought, okay? So the fear is that you're going to hurt someone if you step on a crack. And then the compulsive behavior to make sure that you don't hurt someone is not to step on a crack. And I will tell you that my son, Aaron, really latched onto this, and we would be at an airport getting ready to get on a flight, and I'd be walking next to him, and he would walk like this. trying to avoid the lines in the carpet. And he'd run into people. He was so obsessed with the thoughts of I can't step across anything that has a line that he wouldn't pay attention to what was going on. And that would alleviate his fears. Most of the time, these fears are quite irrational. Germs are crawling into my skin. I'm going to go to hell. I'm going to hurt someone. Then we get to the compulsions. The compulsions are behaviors that we very imaginatively come up with to make the fear go away. And if you do this compulsive behavior, the fear will go away temporarily. So, some you may have heard of, hand washing, if you have a lot of germ fears, okay? Checking the locks, if you're worried about someone stealing from you. One my husband has, I don't say he has OCD, but he's very compulsively early to everything because his fear is, I don't know if his fear is to be late or his fear is of missing something important. I'm the exact opposite. I like to be late, and so we have a lot of conflict around that. And often these behaviors are repetitive, and they're often very similar to what you might see in children with CHARGE who have repetitive behaviors. The behaviors are meant to reduce the anxiety. That's what they are for. So some brief examples of what these might look like. Obsessions. These also come out of our diagnostic and statistical manual as very typical obsessive fears or thoughts. Harm to your property. Will you have a burglar? Will there be a fire? Will you lose something important? Contamination with a deadly disease, I've already said. Harm to a loved one or fear you will harm someone. And then we have these magical thoughts. Step on a crack, I've talked about. A number or a day is good or bad. Hearing or saying bad words will produce bad results. And fear of not having everything just right, just lined up perfectly. Okay. So then we look at some of these compulsion behaviors that people typically go to for these, and we see these over and over again with people with OCD. So if you're afraid you will have harm to your property, you check your lock. Make sure you lock the door. How many of you make sure you locked the door? How many of you may check twice? People with OCD may go back and check 7 or 8 times, or whatever their magical number is. They may get in their car, begin to drive to work, begin to be fearful that someone's going to break in their house, and drive 2 or 3 miles back to check it one more time. They may, if you're afraid of harm to property, you may go and check that the oven has been turned off over and over, or the stove. And it's not just the normal checking that we do, gosh, I'm not sure if I really did it, but checking over and over and over again, even though you have done it already. Contamination, washing your hands. My son Aaron had, it's gotten a lot better, a very huge fear of germs. And this started when I showed him the movie of the play, the musical Rent. Are you familiar with that? It's about AIDS. And so HIV/AIDS, and he was too young to see it. I was showing it to him because I loved the music. But the fear of that still bothers him, and he won't watch the movie to this day. He's almost 19. But deadly diseases really frighten him. And so he began washing his hands repeatedly. He touched something, he washes his hands. He still won't touch dirty dishes that someone else has touched, which is difficult because he won't wash dishes for us. He won't empty the trash either, too germy. But he got to the point where he was washing his hands so much that they were raw and bleeding. And this is a problem because your skin is a protective organ, right? You can get feces and mucus on your hands and germs all over your hands, and your skin will protect you as long as you wash it off. It's when things get into your mucous organs or you've got into your bloodstream that it's a problem. So washing your hands until they bleed, that's a good invitation to germs. And the typical type of treatment for OCD is called exposure with response prevention. And so for someone who is compulsively hand washing all the time, you would expose them to germs on their hands and not let them wash. Okay? And it doesn't take very long. Often it is done with a therapist helping to calm you down, and you are given a public toilet seat on a table and you put your hands on the toilet seat. But you understand it's an irrational fear, so I could bring a brand new toilet seat from a store, unwrap it, put it in front of them and tell them it's a public toilet seat, and it would work because they would believe it. You only do this if people are willing to do it. You would never force someone into this. It has to be getting in the way of their life enough that they want to get better. And it's very fear-producing because if you can't compulsively wash your hands, what will happen to you? You will have a panic attack. And the trick is to keep your hands on that toilet seat while you're panicking, while the therapist is calming you down, calming you down, calming you down. And it may take 5 or 6 hours. But eventually the adrenaline in your system can no longer sustain the fear, and you will calm down. And once you've calmed down, then you're allowed to go wash your hands because you're not reinforcing the fear. You've calmed down. And after that, people lose their fear of germs. It's just that simple. It's called behavioral therapy. So that's the typical kind of treatment. Other people may take anti-anxiety medications, and that helps as well. But the first go-to treatment is the behavioral therapy, exposure to what you're afraid of and preventing you from responding the normal way. Do any of you set your alarm clock or your television remote to an even or odd number on purpose? No one does that? My students always raise their hands. It must be an even number. It must be 11:32. It can't be 11:33. Anything like that? We all have really small compulsions like that that just make us feel better. But if you have OCD, it's something that you do all the time. Maybe this is an American thing because we're so stressed and hurried and we have so much to do all the time. You do that? Rob does it? Oh. You're retired. You don't, right? Okay. Some people have special numbers, which I'll talk about in a minute. Saying bad words. My son used to do this. If you say a religious type of bad word, like hell or damn or Jesus Christ or something like that, he would mumble under his breath the right word. So he would say heck, darn, Judas Priest, or some other kind of word like that. And it didn't matter if he said it or someone else said it. You would see his mouth doing that because it frightened him so much. And that would fix it for him and take his anxiety away. But not other swear words. I mean, he drops, I don't know what you call it here, but he drops the F-bomb all the time. Do you know what I mean by that? He says fuck constantly. So really, really bad word. But if it's a religious word, he will not say it. And he's an atheist. So it is very irrational. It makes no sense. Okay. So I just want to quickly go over this, that it's a very difficult pattern to get out of. It comes from the idea of reinforcement, behavioral reinforcement. If you've heard of this, if you wash the dishes, I'll give you $5. That's a reinforcement. It's a reward, okay? So reinforcement is reward. When I have a fear of germs and I wash my hands, first the fear goes up because I'm thinking of the germs. When I compulsively wash my hands, what happens to me? I feel better. And feeling better is a huge sense of relief. And that's a reward. That's a reinforcement. So every time I get that fear, every time I wash my hands, I'm rewarding the behavior. And when behavior is rewarded, it increases. Okay? The more you reward yourself for something, the more often you're going to do it. So it's an incessant pattern. You have the anxiety-producing thought, and then you wash your hands, you feel better, but only for a little while. And then you'll have the thought again, and you'll wash your hands again. And the more you do it, the stronger it gets. So here's an example of what I went through at about age 16. I told you I had an obsession with sin and fear of hell. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why. Maybe hormonal things set me off. I lived in a chaotic household. There was spousal abuse in my household. There was divorce. There was alcoholism. I probably just had a lot of natural anxiety for those things, and I used these methods to cope. So I developed a very long prayer I said every night before I went to sleep. I could not sleep without doing it. I drove my sister crazy, who slept in a bed in the same room. And one night I actually wrote down the whole thing, and I still have the journal that I wrote it in, and it's 7, 8, 9, 10 pages of repetitive, please, thank you to God, all these very strange, when you look at it, you can see it's a disorder. But I couldn't sleep without doing it, and I couldn't sleep without saying it a certain number of times, the magic number that made me feel better. So we have a prayer that some people say before they go to sleep in the US, and it goes like this. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Have you heard that, some of you? Okay. That terrified me because I was 16 and death is frightening to a 16-year-old. You know, we just didn't deal with that well. We were also in the middle of the Cold War at that time, always thinking somebody was going to push the red button and the whole world would blow up. We also had a very serious serial killer in our town that was attacking people randomly. So a lot of anxiety. So I was afraid of not waking up. The only way to avoid dying in your sleep is to not go to sleep. So I'd stay up all night. And then I have to go to school asleep. Rigidly applying rules. I had magic numbers. 7, 15, 17, 25, and 37 were my magic numbers. If I did something 6 times, I had to do it that one more time. Okay? And if I went over 7, then I went to the next magic number. And it was things like practicing piano pieces, play them a certain number of times. It was things like touching objects a certain number of times. And it sounds really weird to people who have not experienced it. Unwind when you turn around. Oh, and let me just say with the numbers that my son Aaron hates the number 7. That was the bad number for him. For me, it was the magical number, so it makes no sense. But how about this one? You have to turn around to get something, and then you have to unwind. These very odd-looking behaviors. Because I was afraid of dying in my sleep, I would also sit outside while the sun set and just cry and have a panic attack. I've talked about the fear of religious things, but my point here is this was so debilitating that I couldn't do anything else. I couldn't concentrate on regular high school classes, having boyfriends, studying, all the things that a typical teenager would do. I was swept up in this all the time. And it totally took over my life. And this is true of a lot of people with true OCD. I don't know how I grew out of it. It just gradually went away for me. Most people will need pretty intense therapy. So having given you this background on OCD, I want to talk about my conclusions after raising my own son and seeing lots of children and young adults with CHARGE, and my conclusion is they don't have true OCD. True OCD comes from very irrational thoughts. And they don't need traditional intervention being exposed to the irrational thoughts. My idea here is that people with CHARGE syndrome have real, true anxiety that's rational. They're getting exposed to the fearful things all the time. Surgeries, shots, all kinds of physical therapy, medical problems, being deaf and blind and not knowing what's coming next causes a lot of real anxiety. It's not irrational. Okay, so if we see them doing compulsive behaviors, it's because they need them. So here are some OCD-like behaviors, which is what we're calling them now, in CHARGE syndrome. My son Jacob uses everything must be right. So he sits at his little table in his house, and this is what he does when he's eating dinner. And if you take something and move it away, he will put it right back where it was. If I move it here, he puts it right back. It has to be exactly right. Is that an obsession? Is that a compulsion? Or is that because this is where he can see things? This is where he knows things are. He knows that the water is there, and when he reaches for it, it will be there. It's safe, it feels secure, he's not gonna knock it down, he can see it there, he can rely on it. He's missing so much other information. He also orders things and makes them symmetrical. So if you give him things, he will line them up. Okay, you see that a lot in true OCD, but he does it probably for the reason that then he knows what's there. Light switches. When he comes over to our house, the first thing he does is go in every room and turn on the light switches. Why would that be important? Maybe it helps him see, yeah. But I think also because he'll do it when there's very bright sunlight, it's become a habit. He does a lot of things very routinely. He walks up the stairs, he walks over, and if you try to take him somewhere else, he will drag you back to the light switch and flip it on before he'll go. So it's sort of become a routine habit for him. This is what I do when I'm at mom and dad's house. In his own home, if you leave the front door open or the closet door open or his bedroom door open, he will go very much out of his way, even when he's in pain or struggling with walking, to close those doors. He just doesn't like them open. So if you think about how we typically would set up something for a person who is completely blind, it has to be predictable. You will run into things. You will hit your head. And he's fallen and hit his head enough times to know that. I've seen lots of individuals with CHARGE do these kinds of things, line things up. Other things that are reported, we see a lot of kids who ask repetitive questions in social situations. I can't tell you how many children with CHARGE syndrome I have had come up to me at the US CHARGE conference and ask me, what color is my car and what color is my house? Do any of you hear that? And they go around to everybody and say, what color is your car? What color is your house? Or what's your name and how old are you? But they have a specific set of questions that they repeatedly ask everyone. And they remember the answers usually. Stuffing things into slots. We have some friends in Michigan whose son deliberately takes all his very favorite things and stuffs them down the air conditioner vent. That must then be unscrewed very painstakingly by his father and reached down in the dirt to get it. But he does it over and over. And we're not exactly sure what the meaning is of that behavior. Maybe, David, you have some ideas about that one. Unless it's just a matter of I get attention and I get somebody to do this for me. What?
He probably likes his father.
Oh, he likes to see his father unscrewing the thing and cursing. Repetitive, idiosyncratic behaviors like hand movements and tics. So my son will do some of this, especially if he's on sensory overload. He'll get up and do this for a few minutes, and then he calms down. He plays with his hands constantly, always looking at his fingers. He does something with his hands that nobody else can do that's very repetitive, and if you slowed it down in slow motion, we might be able to do it, but I don't know how he does it. We see some kids with CHARGE with difficulty switching activities. It's hard for people who are deafblind in general to switch activities quickly and abruptly without some forewarning. And then, how about this one? All-consuming focus on one idea. Anybody know someone like that? And, you know, we all have hobbies and intense interests, and I'm the first to say that I will look at pictures of my celebrity crush for days. But that's different than imposing it on every social situation that I'm in and talking about it all the time. And so even though we allow ourselves hobbies and interests, and we need to let individuals with CHARGE and any kind of disability have hobbies and interests, sometimes it gets so intense that it gets in the way of their lives. And I'm sure there are many other things you've observed. So Kim Blake has been here, right? Kim Blake and I did some research a few years ago. It says in process here, but it actually was published this past week in the Journal of American Medical Genetics. And one of the things we found, this was from going to a CHARGE syndrome conference in the US, and we found that doing surveys with a whole bunch of individuals and their parents, we found that almost half of the children had OCD-like behaviors. We had a list of all of these different tics and things. And then we found that almost half of them also had anxiety. Here's a David Brown quote. I have lots of these, because he can just make sense of things when I can't. A lot of what looks like OCD in CHARGE is really just a reaction to having multisensory impairments. If your senses were taken away, you would do the same thing. So they're really very creative responses. They may not look normal, but if they work for the child, they're very smart ways to deal with things. And let's talk about some of this. I want to say here that there's no reason that someone with CHARGE syndrome couldn't also develop true OCD, just like someone with CHARGE syndrome could also have autism. I mean, if these things are genetic and brain-based, this population could have all the same things. They could have schizophrenia. You know, that 1% could have schizophrenia because that's 1% of the population. Who knows? But it's not the norm. Normally what we're seeing, I believe, is a reaction to sensory impairment. So 50% have anxiety. What could they possibly be anxious about? This is my son, Jacob. Mom and Dad? Mom and Dad are coming over again. Oh, okay, I can hear you, David. This is actually Jacob's typical posture of holding his head, leaning his elbows in and holding his head so he can use his vision better. So, here are some things that may produce real anxiety that is understandable in individuals with CHARGE syndrome. Pain. Pain is always the #1 thing I look for when consulting for families with CHARGE syndrome. I have witnessed far too many times children that are probably in pain being punished for their behavior in schools, and maybe even by parents, but it's typically more often seen in segregated school settings where people have worked with people with severe disabilities in the wrong way for a long time. And I'm not saying all teachers are like that. There are wonderful, wonderful teachers, but we happen to have some where I live that are just awful, and would never have let Jacob in that classroom. So I look at pain first. Second, I look at sensory issues. Is the child getting too overloaded with information in their nervous system? There's too much going on and they just can't cope with it. And so they act out in a way to get away from it. Underload. Are they getting enough sensory information? Okay. And those of you who are falling asleep while I'm talking are on sensory underload. Or it's just very warm in here, really. It's very warm. I was sitting up here pretending it was jet lag, but it was really just warmth for me. This picture on the left has a little girl on the beach. It says, wanted to build a castle, had to touch sand. So most of us have seen our kids get on sensory overload, just too much. And like I said, then Jacob has to get up and work it out for a few minutes, and then he's okay. I am very introverted. I tend to get on sensory overload in places like this with all these people and talking to a lot of people, and then I have to go back to my room and sit for 10 minutes, just breathe, get my energy back by being alone. That's what introversion is. You like that picture? What about just plain boredom? When you're bored, what do? Let's see what I see out here. People are tapping their pencils, chewing gum, moving their feet back and forth. Actually, you guys aren't doing too much self-stimulation right now. It's nice. Many of you are fanning, which makes sense. So when you're really bored, when you're listening to a boring lecture, like when Tim comes up here, do you bounce your legs? Yeah. I'm sorry, Tim. You can get me back, okay? I give you permission. He will. Do you play with your hair? Bite your nails? I do that a lot. Not only does it give me sensory feedback on my fingers, but it gives it to my jaw, which is really important. Chewing gum does that too, helps me stay alert. And now that we have smartphones, when Jacob was born, in our first 5 years, we were spending so much time in hospitals and doctor waiting rooms. I was so bored all the time, but now I just open up Candy Crush. You guys? But that doesn't help Jacob. He doesn't play Candy Crush, so he just still sits there and rocks while he's waiting. So these are all ways to keep ourselves alert and occupied. Now, our kids do a lot of these things too, but they just don't look as normal as what we're doing. I mean, we all see people bouncing their legs, biting their nails, but that's really different than doing something like this. Or what my son does, and I can't imitate it, he croaks. Maybe I can imitate it. Does that sound right? No. Constantly croaks. So these things just don't look normal, and many parents and professionals want to fix that because you want your child to be accepted in society. But I say, they're fixing their own sensory underload or overload themselves. You don't have to do anything. Just leave them be. How about checking? Here's Jacob, who is lying on he has a mat in front of a big window, and he has all of his things arranged just so, the way he likes them. This is a Christmas decoration that has lights in it. It's very sparkly. He's got it right in his line of vision. He has one of the gold, what are these things called? Garland, a Christmas tree, goes around a Christmas tree decoration. Right up under his chin, he's got one over his forehead, and then he's got, I don't know what that is, a fan maybe in his left hand. And if I moved any of that, again, he would have moved it just back to where it was, because it was just perfect for what he needed right then. So here I have David Brown's thoughts again. I did that. Click which? How do I get out of this? There, did I get it? Okay. If you don't have all the sensory information you need to be reassured, your environment is chaotic and constantly changing, it makes sense to do things like tapping things with your hand. Is it still there? Running your hand along the edge of a table to make sure you know where it is in space. Arranging items in rows and stacks so you can get to them when you need to. Confirming where things are. And then constantly going back and checking, is it still there? Can I still count on that being there? Which makes sense when you can't see. And David then goes on to say, if small things can change, then bigger things can change too, and that can be really scary. So we've talked about pain. We've talked about sensory overload, underload, and boredom. What about sleep? In our recent article that was just published, we found that sleep and anxiety were huge in the CHARGE population. In the general population, research tells us that there's a strong association between anxiety and sleep. So either those people who have a lot of anxiety aren't sleeping well, which makes sense if you can't relax. Anxiety brings your nervous system up, and sleep brings your nervous system down, so they kind of clash. Or are those people who aren't sleeping well then developing more anxiety? How do you feel after a day of no sleep? Can you get more anxious? Okay, so we're not sure which way that relationship goes, but I believe they sort of dovetail and they will cause each other to happen. So we found almost 60% of children and young adults and adolescents with CHARGE had sleep problems. Can I see a show of hands if you or your child, a person with CHARGE or your child has sleep problems? Oh yeah, it looked like about 60%, okay. So if we can increase the sleep quality for these children, anxiety might lessen based on this. It's correlational research, so it's difficult to say there's really a cause. But in my experience, I feel like there is. And if we can reduce anxiety, we may be able to increase sleep quality. So if we can make things predictable, make sure kids aren't bored or overstimulated and are not in pain, those are 3 things to look at. And Tim will talk about in a few minutes how to make things more predictable. Now, I think there's one more thing that causes anxiety, and this is true in all of us, and that is stress. I love this little clip art because you can't really tell what's what in it, and it just feels like everything is all over the place and you can't make sense of it. How many of you feel that way in your lives? Raising a child with CHARGE can be so complex. So, if your life is chaotic and you don't know what's going to happen on any given day, and you can't see, hear, balance, or predict, you might want to escape or control that chaos. And so these behaviors may be ways of escaping or controlling. So while my son Jacob used to just rub his head like this or hold his head up, often what we see now is this. And this means he doesn't have to respond to his environment, because if I can't see you, you can't see me, right? So we will see some strange behaviors because children want to escape. So we've talked about these 4 things: stress, pain, sensory overload, underload, and anxiety. And sleep, sleep. And so the question is, when do you intervene? And this is supposed to be a play on words, to be or not to be, from Shakespeare. To do or not to do. When do you intervene? The first thing we need to do is figure out the purpose of the behavior. We've heard from Tim for many years that all behavior is communication, especially with our children who don't have really well-developed formal language. You really have to watch their behavior carefully to figure out what's going on. What is the goal? What is the function of that behavior? Why is my son have his hands over his eyes? Why is he jumping up and down? Okay? Why are you rubbing your head or scratching your head right now? Are you trying to wake yourself up, stay awake in this very warm room? Secondly, what looks like a very inappropriate goal may be masking something else. What color is your car? What color is your house? Why would somebody develop that behavior and use it over and over again? Maybe they know that they're at the CHARGE conference and they're supposed to interact with people. They're supposed to be polite, they're supposed to have conversations, but they don't really know how to do that except to ask these two questions. So they do it over and over and over again so that they can be a part of the group and feel accepted. Maybe there are so many people around in a chaotic situation, like, was it you that said this morning, or Gail? I can't remember how do these kids cope with all the chaos of the conference after having very ordered lives. Yeah, it's amazing. And in order to do that, maybe they need to ask those questions so that they feel like something is predictable. I'll always get a color. I'll always get a color, and I can keep that in my head. And do they just need to know more about people and know that the people they're talking to are safe for them? Oh, I forgot to put that down. So I have a little story I want to tell about a young adult, did not have CHARGE syndrome, but she had pretty obvious intellectual disabilities. And she was working in what we call in the US a sheltered workshop. So it's a day program where people with developmental disabilities go during the day, they're bused there during the day, gives them something to do all day. But a sheltered workshop is actually a place of work. So at this place of work, the automobile companies would send what we call piecework. So they may take things out of a box and they have to put this bolt on this screw, put this bolt on this screw, put this bolt on this screw, and the company is paid to do it and then they send it back. Or build cardboard boxes is another one. So things that people with intellectual disabilities can do and get paid for, 7 cents an hour. But it gives them something to do so they're not at home all day bored. A lot of people don't really like doing it. It's a loud environment with a lot of people that they don't like being with, but that's another whole lecture on inclusion in society and individualizing work. But I was working with a woman there doing what we call a person-centered plan, and we asked her what are her dreams and goals. And she kept saying, I want to be a professor. And of course we all looked at her and thought, wow, that's a very lofty goal for someone who's unable to read, doesn't communicate well and things. And so we just kept probing it. I kept probing with her to think, what is it about being a professor that she is craving? And it turns out that when you asked her, if somebody took the time to ask her why she wanted to be a professor, it's because she'd have a title and a nameplate. That was her reason. Of course, they're all thinking, well, she can't go to college. How's she going to write a dissertation? She won't be able to teach. And I'm thinking, what is it that she wants about being a professor? And it's a recognition of being important. Okay? So they decided to give her a nameplate and call her some like assistant shift supervisor or something. She was thrilled. That's all she wanted. So often, what seems like a real unrealistic goal is really something else going on if you can really get at what it is about that job that they want. So step 1, identify the purpose of the behavior. Step 2, how important, how urgent is it? And I've got more David Brown here. David Brown put together these urgency of intervention questions for a deaf-blind teaching module, right, in the US. This is what this is from. How quickly do you need to intervene, okay? Is this a behavior that just bugs you, that just bothers you, and you'd like to get rid of it? Like my son Jacob croaking bothers me, especially when we're sitting maybe in a church, very quiet church, and he's croaking during the sermon. We have a very understanding priest. So that's a behavior we just ignore. We let him do it. He enjoys it. It gives him rhythmic sounds, movements. Hey, he's making noise with his cochlear implant. That's really cool, right? That's an important first step. Second, is it a behavior that seems to help him function in a positive way so that you can ignore it? Do we really care if Jacob comes in and turns all the light switches on in our house? You know, if it's helping him to feel safe, organized, less anxious, be able to see better, I don't really care. When he leaves, we turn them back off. It's not a big deal. We can ignore that. Is it a behavior that helps him to function in a positive way, but we really probably should reduce it or replace it with another behavior? The example I came up with for this is that Jacob used to take his glasses and cochlear off and just throw them wherever they went, right? And the glasses would break and the cochlear would get lost and all of these kinds of things. And so that was something we really needed to change. His goal was to get them off, right? He just needed some organization about where to put them. So now he has 2 places in his home. He takes them off and he puts them on the picture of the glasses. Or he knows to hand them to someone. And we've just repetitively had him do that over and over and over again until now it's become habit for him. A lot of things for him are just habitual, and he'll do them because he feels better organizing his world that way. Is this a behavior that is undesirable and really needs to be reduced or replaced over time? Jacob had a behavior for a long time that we really needed to change, and this was feces smearing. Anybody ever have to deal with that? Besides Tim? Anybody want to admit to having cleaned that off the walls and the television set and the banister of the stairs and the bedroom carpet? He'd be in his bedroom and come up to the upstairs of our house to find us, but along the way he had touched everything. This kind of needed to stop. So this was something we needed to intervene with. And it basically came down to having him very scheduled on his toilet training because he doesn't ask to use the bathroom. So that's something we really needed to change. Is this a behavior that needs to be prevented immediately? When Jacob was about 4 years old, he was not walking yet. He didn't walk till 7. He started banging his head on the wall. And it was a self-stimulation for him. He wasn't doing it because he was in pain, and he wasn't hitting his head hard enough to really cause true damage, like concussive damage. But he would rhythmically hit his head on the wall. And it was hard enough that I felt like we need to intervene. We don't want this to get worse. We know that with the coloboma of the retina, hitting your head a lot can help you have a detached retina and lose what vision you have and things like that. So that was something we needed to intervene on right away. And actually what really worked for us, and it didn't take very long, was just putting our hand on the wall where he was banging. So he'd bang against our hand, and it just didn't give him the same input, so he quit trying. He stopped doing it. It was a really good intervention. Okay, so you decide what the function of the behavior is. Secondly, you decide whether or not or how to intervene, whether or not you need to intervene. Is it something you can let go? And then finally, you intervene, but only if necessary. So how do we intervene with pain? We probably have all seen our kids devolve, if you know that word, the opposite of evolve. Devolve in their behavior to get someone's attention. So Jacob may be in pain, and because he doesn't have a way to express pain to us, he may begin to start walking with me and holding on a lot harder. He may start making spitting noises. He may go in his room and not come out. He may start rubbing things in his neck, all these kinds of things. And if we don't do something by recognizing his pain, giving him, I don't know what you call it here, acetaminophen or something like that, his pain will get worse, his behavior will get worse until we figure it out. It's not his communication problem, it's our ability to understand what he's saying. And he will keep going until we figure it out. And he'll keep going until he's pinching and biting us if we're not figuring out. And that means his biting is not a behavior that needs to be stopped. That would be horrible. What if he was having an appendicitis and he bit me to let me know about it? Do I want to give him medication and punish him for biting me? No, I want to figure out what's wrong. So pain is always the first thing I look at for my own son and for many others, especially if it's a behavior that you don't see often. You typically have a calm, cool, collected child, and now they're doing all these very strange things. There's something going on with their body, typically. So these are the kinds of behaviors you will see. When over time we have learned about Jacob's behaviors, well, I have written up here, I don't know how it's written up there, but blowing raspberries, which is, that's called blowing raspberries in English. That usually means he's got gas pain, and we've just learned that over time, that we do abdominal massage, we give him gas-lowering medications, and he will stop. When he digs things into his neck really hard, he'll take very sharp objects and cram them into his neck, and we've learned over time that that means he's developing an ear infection. And so and those are the main two things he gets. And so when he shows us those pain behaviors, often we'll take him to the doctor, and the doctor will say, I don't see any ear infection, and then we go back the next day, and then you can see it. But he's telling us he feels it before it actually happens. So we've learned to understand his pain behaviors. Casey Stratton, is her name still Stratton? She got married. Oh, Casey Gadke, right? Who was one of Tim's former students, developed a CHARGE pain scale. I don't know if you've seen this before, but this is a way to look at if your child is non-vocal, how much you think they are in pain. So these are the kinds of things you look at. And then I believe the overall score at the end tells you, it's no overall score? Okay, so you're just looking at these things. But it's a really good way to look at things that are unusual in your child that might be indicating pain. What time am I done? 3:45? Okay. Sensory problems. How do we intervene with those? So most of you have probably heard of sensory integration, using deep pressure. We used to do brushing with surgical scrub brush, joint compressions on Jacob, pushing your joints together. Jacob has a weighted vest. It's full of sand. He has a weighted blanket. When he lies down and you put that over him, it feels really good. So how does it feel to you when you've got a lot of heavy blankets over you, especially in the winter? It's not just the warmth you feel, but that weight gives you some sensory calming, okay? And then all of a sudden you only have one blanket and you feel a little out of it because you're used to having that heavy pressure. Same thing is true of massage. Has anyone had a massage? If you haven't, you should. It's deep pressure on your muscles, and it's very calming, and at the end you're usually asleep. So those are things to bring the arousal level down. We've talked about kids jumping up and down. That's joint compression. So they're very over-aroused. They get up and they jump up and down, and they're actually calming their sensory system down. What about bringing the arousal level up? Was it Gail that was talking about the sensory room, or was that you? Gail, okay. So having a sensory room, having things to do in a special room for children. Let them play with water, let them play with tactile toys, things like that to get themselves. You all need a sensory arousal break right now. I think I can tell by looking at you. Allow them to withdraw when they're overwhelmed. Jacob used to have a refrigerator box, cardboard box in his kindergarten room with Lily Nielsen type things hanging from it that he could play with. And when he was overwhelmed in his kindergarten, he could crawl into his box and just get away. We didn't realize it at the time, but we should have put holes in the box because he always fell asleep. I don't think he was getting enough air. But that was a way to withdraw, go to sleep, right? What about boredom? Here's a picture of Jacob at his, what we call, it's a team meeting at school to discuss his goals and objectives for the next year. We call it an individual education plan, or IEP. And he had the most wonderful intervener, and she brought him to his IEP, and he took his place, and she has a basket that she brings with her full of all of his favorite sensory things. And while we're in the meeting, this is what he does. He pulls them out, he arranges them the way he wants them so he can see everything, pulled some things out, put some things back, and he had everything he needed to stay alert during the meeting and feel very content, even though he didn't really understand what the meeting was for or what we were doing, but he was there, which was important. So you may see rocking, blowing, hand flapping, all kinds of things. If you can't see or hear what everybody else is doing, you can't see the TV in the doctor's office that everyone else is watching, you're going to start doing something else to get your brain moving. If you don't have a smartphone, you can't play Candy Crush. So you need something to stimulate your brain. For Jacob, these are the kinds of things that stimulate his brain. For a lot of our kids, though, I've seen at conferences, they've now got iPads and all kinds of things that they can do things with. He just doesn't typically access that. Checking behavior, we talked about already. Allow it as it serves a clear purpose for them. Obviously, they need the ability to make sure their things are where they are. We know one young man in Iowa who has a very, his parents would say probably obsession with the game Zelda. Do you know the game Zelda? Yeah, a lot of fun. And you go in his bedroom and there are posters everywhere and he's got magazines and he's got the game right in front of him. And it's very neatly organized. He needs to have things right where he needs them. Now I have a son, my 21-year-old, who is obsessed with Zelda. And is that an obsession or just an interest? I don't know. He's a 21-year-old young man and he loves to play it. And he's got hats and he's got clothes and he's got pillows and he's got all the games. You know, whether you call it an obsession or not, I guess, I hope doesn't depend on whether it's a person with a disability. So make the environment as stable and predictable as possible really helps with that checking behavior. The agency that funds Jacob's home often tries to convince us to let him have a roommate because they want to save money. And we don't want to do that, partly because Jacob's home is so predictable. If you put another person in there with or without a disability, it's going to change the whole environment. His things are where they are and they need to stay there. Which one do I? This one? Okay. Now, which slide am I on? That's the checking. Okay, that's the one I just talked about. And finally, sleep. How can you improve the quality of sleep? I don't know if you've ever heard of sleep hygiene, but this is something we do as psychologists to help young children without disabilities and their parents sleep through the night. You have a routine that you associate with going to sleep. My routine is I do my washing up, I get my drink of water, I read for a while, I lie in bed. I always start on my right side with my pillow just tucked under my neck, and I pull the covers up over my shoulders. Do you have a routine similar to that you do to help you fall asleep every night? And again, it's psychological, behavioral. You start associating that with getting drowsy. So if you do that every night, it actually helps you get drowsy. So for young children, we talk about read a book, brush your teeth, put on your pajamas, parents sing you a song. You get used to that making you drowsy over time. So can we create sleep hygiene for our children with CHARGE syndrome instead of just having time for bed, chaos, you know, any different time every night, which I know a lot of parents of kids without CHARGE who do that. So that's important. Pay attention to sensory overload. We all know that young children, even without CHARGE syndrome, if they get overstimulated and stay up too late, it's really hard to get them to go to sleep. And some people, and I'm not a physician, so I don't recommend that. I'll let the physicians actually talk about this, but some people find that the hormone melatonin helps set off your pineal gland and helps you fall asleep. A lot of our kids don't get the light cues from outside when it gets dark because of their vision, and that's what causes melatonin to be released in the brain, help you fall asleep. Jacob often has many more problems falling asleep in the summertime because the sun is out until 9:30, 10 o'clock, and so he doesn't get that melatonin drop, and we often have to give him a melatonin pill, and it works great for him. But most of all, I did it again. Reduce the anxiety. How many of you who are mothers, and I can say this because I'm a mother, lie in bed and think about all the things you have to take care of the next day before you go to sleep? I found that what I do, what I do to reduce the anxiety is I have a notepad next to my bed. If I write it all down and get it out of my head, I feel better, right? I reduce the anxiety and then I can sleep. So, we want to make order out of chaos for our kids so they'll feel less anxious. The less anxious they feel, the fewer strange anxiety-producing behaviors they'll have. They're probably always going to have behaviors related to their sensory needs. But if they're truly having anxiety, the more predictable we can make their environment, the better. And I would continue to talk about ways to do that, but Tim stole that from me and we'll be talking about, I'm sorry, I'm just kidding. He'll be following this with ways to put together calendar systems, predictable days, and things like that for your child so that they can feel that the world is predictable to them and they know what's coming next. I will say one thing we have not figured out how to do yet is to let Jacob know we are leaving. And so he gets anxious when we're gone from home for more than a week or so. A few years ago, we took a trip to Spain for 3 weeks, and when we came back, we found from his caregivers that his behavior got really erratic. And I think it's because we weren't coming over and seeing him every day. We have not quite figured that out because he doesn't recognize photographs of us, so I'm not quite sure how to tell him we're going and this is where we're coming back, but we're still working on it. Unfortunately, we only think about it at those rare times when we're getting ready to leave and it's too late. So we should go home and figure it out this time. So to bring us back to the beginning, my goal here was to clarify that OCD is a mental health disorder, and it's diagnosed way too much in our children. Our kids have way too many diagnoses as it is. I just want my kid to have that CHARGE syndrome diagnosis so that people can understand him. I don't need OCD and all these other autistic and other diagnoses added on to that for any reason. He has CHARGE, and he has everything that comes with CHARGE, and that's enough. So instead of slapping that diagnosis on them and giving them medications to medicate away their behaviors, we really need to pay attention to their anxiety, their sleep, their pain, and all of these other things, because they are using them functionally to get through life. And it's very important that they be allowed to do that. Are there any questions for me? I got done a little early, so you can get out of this very hot room for a few minutes. No? Well, I will be available. Oh, we have one question. Oh, let me get my...
Yeah. May I ask in German because my English is not so good? Yeah. Sie sagten Medikation.
We talked about medication is not always the right thing. The problem is, in our case, that the school where he is, they're saying that the medication is so great, and we took him off the medication because our experience was actually the opposite. And it is our impression that these drugs he's getting, they take away his sleep, and it makes him even more tense. then you know, it makes him more tense. The medication doesn't help him at all, and sometimes his frustration level is very low. He reacts really quickly. He starts to hit himself, bite himself, and with the drugs, that was we were able to stop that. However, he was not tense at certain times. He was tense constantly, and he started doing other stuff. For example, in the night, when we were sleeping, we sleep with our doors open, so we notice what he's doing. For example, during the night, he was biting himself in his bed, or when he went to the bathroom, he bit himself in the finger, or he hit himself. And what I needed to do, and what I still don't understand whether it's the right thing or not, you know, when it comes to stop him from doing certain behaviors, compulsive behaviors, I interfere. And when I interfere, it leads for him, well, it leads him to do it even harder, even more. He wants to be stronger than me. He's then doing push-ups, for example, because he wants to be stronger than me. And currently, I'm in the difficult situation that I simply don't know. You know, how do I do justice to the school where he's at? Or what is actually the best thing for him? What I can do not to harm him, but to help him get over his compulsions.
So I want to make sure I understand. He is doing more when on the medication, or the medication is helping him not to do so much?
This medication changed a little bit, but it doesn't reduce. It moves another section.
Okay.
I think it is more, and it's more continuous, and he get less sleep. And we stop the medication and allowed him to sleep as long as he wants, and he calms down.
So your feeling is that the medication is not necessary at this point?
Well, at least this is not the right one. We have tested a lot of them. The first, 15 years ago, we tried with, what was the name? It's something that calm.
It will be different for me anyway, the name. So,
Well, the last medication is risperidone.
oh, yes.
And the institution where he is living at the moment, they say it's getting better with him, but they are not able to observe him during the night and all the time. When he's at home, we can see him 24 hours a day, and we can observe all his behavior during the whole day. Mm-hmm. And we see the medication reduce in one area something, but it increases his bad behavior in other sections.
I see. So it sounds to me, and I would urge you to sign up for a consultation with maybe the physicians and the educators, so we could really talk about this in more depth and maybe give you some ideas. But it sounds to me that the medication overall is merely masking maybe what's going on underneath, that there possibly will be pain or sensory overload or underload, or, you know, there are so many things that can cause pain, back problems, and maybe needing to go to the bathroom, things like that. So before I would recommend anyone go to a doctor for medication, and I'm not a physician, so I can't recommend one or the other, but as a psychologist, I will always look at these areas first. And with my own son, when we've had biting and head banging, it's always been related to pain. And the last thing you want to do is give medication when maybe there's something wrong. I mean, I know a person in the United States that we're friends with their family. She has CHARGE syndrome. She's much older. She was one of the first people diagnosed. And she had a retinal detachment, if you understand what I'm saying. And she was banging her head because her vision was changing. And because the school couldn't figure that out and they medicated her, her retina detached and she's completely blind now. So ignoring the signals of pain can cause some serious problems. And that's not to say that some children may not have a behavior that you just need to intervene. Like I said, biting is not good. But if sleeping better without the medication, sleep is so important to all of us. I can't recommend one way or the other medically, but I would love to have you come and talk to us as a group to consult about that. And the second thing I would say as a school psychologist and as a parent of a child with CHARGE is that the parents are usually right about things like that. And so often schools recommend medications, and these are teachers, they're not physicians. So they really shouldn't be recommending medication. It should come from, I'm sorry? Well, Tim says it makes their life easier. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing for the person. So it's something to discuss further. Any other questions?
French. Bonjour. En fait, j'aimerais poser une question par rapport aux médicaments, toujours, et l'anxiété.
I have a question. Also, it's also about medication. I'm an adult. I have been diagnosed with CHARGE syndrome. The person sitting next to me said, "Why don't you get up?" And I'm taking Seroflex, which is an antidepressant, and these antidepressants give me a certain stabilization for my anxieties. And I have to say that before that, I had a lot of anxiety, phases. That was especially last year in October and also this year in March. And ever since I've been taking these drugs, I have reached a certain level over the course of the year. I have been able to stabilize my fears, my anxieties. You have said that this drug doesn't necessarily help, and I'm questioning what you said.
Oh, I completely understand what you're saying. I take anti-anxiety medication myself, so it stabilizes me as well. I'm not in any way trying to say that, especially someone who is I don't know how to say this in what? Capable, thank you. Tim told me the right politically correct word to say. So capable as you to be able to communicate your anxieties. I need to get where I can see you. I can't see you. And talk in the microphone at the same time. Thank you. Someone as capable as you who's able to communicate that, I think that's so important. And as I said, there's nothing that says people with CHARGE syndrome can't have very basic anxiety and need medications for that. I'm mostly trying to speak for those individuals who cannot tell us what's going on. And that I think often we miss what's going on because we medicate first. And with you, you're able to tell us what's going on. You would be able to tell your parents or your caregivers or just your doctor or whoever that you're in pain if you have pain. And you were able to tell them that you are in psychic pain with anxiety, depression, things like that. And if you can communicate that, definitely, I think that's wonderful that you've been able to get relief. When I look at the younger children who are being put on so many medications because of behaviors that someone doesn't like, instead of trying to decipher what the behavior means, these are the individuals I'm trying to address here. So no, I in no way say that nobody with CHARGE ever should have medication. No, I don't believe that at all. I have just found that if I can pay attention to these things with my own child, and I've seen this with other children too who are unable to communicate formally, if I can pay attention to these things, his behaviors disappear, his anxiety disappears. And so that works for some people. But no, I'm more power to you is what we would say in the US. If it's working for you, that's wonderful. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for sitting and listening to me for so long. I really appreciate it, and I love being here.
Wir haben jetzt eine Kaffeepause. Die Kaffeepause wird
We're going
circa
to have a coffee break right now, which will start at 3:45, and we're going to continue again at 4:15 at 4:15.